Okay, so I'm Jonathan Gray, and I'll be chairing this panel on the social life of fake news. So for the past year, I've been Prize Fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, working on the politics of data and helping to set up a new initiative called the Public Data Lab, which is a network of researchers and institutions dedicated to catalysing research, democratic engagement, and public debate around the future of the data society. And around the time we were kind of putting together the lab, fake news kind of really rose to prominence as a sort of significant public issue and sort of controversy. So following on from Susan's keynote this morning, we are going to continue to explore what we can learn from some empirical research on the social life of fake news and misinformation in different settings. And I think one of the things that is shared across several of the pieces of work I want to hear about today is an interest in looking beyond a predominantly instrumental interest in identifying, addressing and cracking down on fake news, whether through automated fact-checking or through new features and initiatives of online platforms or through regulation and fines. And we're interested in slightly slowing down, spending some time with the phenomenon in order to understand it, to follow it, and to examine what it does in different settings. And I think this covers everything, as we've sort of already seen this morning, from geopolitics to propaganda to fueling mistrust and polarization to making money from profit, making things clickable and shareable online, to different forms of satire and amusement and humor and styles of reasoning and deliberation, through to emergent forms of kind of political identity and political culture and counterpublics. So of course we are interested ultimately in different forms of public interventions, but I think that the main interest in this panel this morning is to enrich collective inquiry and public understanding and to catalyse different ways of imagining what the problem is and how we might respond to it. So to this end, one of the things we've been working on with the lab is something which we'll be hearing about more in a moment, which is a project called A Field Guide to Fake News, which was essentially a collective endeavour to develop methods, techniques and recipes for studying the production, circulation, reception and responses to fake news online, using participatory design approaches in collaboration with media organisations, public institutions, NGOs and others, which you can download a sample of at, we'll have the URL a little bit later, at fakenews.publicdatalab.org. And this is currently being turned into a book for researchers, teachers and students interested in these kinds of methods and recipes. And here I'm delighted to have with me today Irina Khaldarova at the media, who's at the Media and Communication Studies Department at the University of Helsinki, who's going to be talking about her very interesting empirical work on the Ukrainian crisis. We have Liliana Bounegru, who's at the universities of Groningen, Ghent, Sciences Po and Columbia, a co-founder of the Public Data Lab and a co-investigator on the fake news Field Guide project. And we have Anders Munk, who is Associate Professor of Techno-Anthropology and Director of the Techno-Anthropology Lab at Aalborg University in Copenhagen, who's going to tell us about some research and interventions in the Danish context. So without further ado, Irina, if you'd like to start.
Good morning, my name is Irina Khaldarova. I'm a PhD student in the University of Helsinki, and today I'm pleased to present my research, which I've been doing together with Merve Panti, my supervisor, about the fake news and how they contributed to the struggle over the news coverage of the Ukrainian crisis. We made a specific focus on the news from television, because television in Russia remains the biggest and the most important source of information, source of news still. It is still there, and the Ukrainian crisis just accentuated the position of television as the government's strongest asset in the information warfare. And according to the most recent data of pollsters, in 2016, around 70% of people cited it as their primary source of information in Russia. And in 2014, when it was the most active phase of the Ukrainian crisis, the number was even bigger. Around 90% of people cited television as their main source of information for the domestic and international news in Russia. So we picked up the biggest channel in Russia, Channel 1 by name. You can see that it is still very popular. 76% turn to Channel 1 for the news and other programs. And it is also the most accessible channel in Russia. Up to 98%, which is huge, can access it in the Russian territory. And none of other media in Russia can enjoy such rate of accessibility. And speaking about popularity, we couldn't skip the issue of trust. So we could see in the pollsters' data also that people who chose television as their primary source of information were most likely also cited as a trustworthy source of information. So they trusted it, and they thought that the events in Ukraine were covered truthfully and without bias by the federal channel. We wanted to see, our research was about how those news from the television, from the most popular channels, were discussed in the internet. And we actually started looking through the comments in the social media and in the Twitter comments in particular, and we discovered that this was the territory, very weak in comparison to the television power, but still where the rival voices could be heard, and that Twitter users started asking the questions and expressing the doubts about the television news from Channel 1 in particular. And what we decided to do is that we wanted to research, to study what was in between two biggest players, because we discovered also that there were people or groups of people who chose this fact-checking as their primary activity, as the counter weapon against the narratives produced by the mainstream media. And so we wanted to study what was in between those news which was produced by Channel 1 as the biggest channel in Russia, and what was then identified as fakes by those public initiatives. We discovered that one of the groups was the most active. This is the initiative created in Ukraine, stopfake.org, which actually made their goal as to challenge the Kremlin's mainstream discourse about the Ukrainian events by debunking the distorted information and the fake images, coming mostly from the Russian media, but also all over the internet and international media. So we decided to do two things with this subject of study. First is to see what those pieces of news identified as fake were telling about, what narratives were behind them, what the government and Channel 1 in particular wanted to say through those fake news. And the second thing, how they were perceived by Twitter users, how they were discussed in the internet. So for that, we collected all publications on Stop Fake website for 14 months, starting from December 1st, 2013 to February 1st, 2015. We collected 300 pieces of publications, and in 30 times, 30, Channel 1 was mentioned as the source of distorted information, and we sampled 10 pieces of news which were most popular in the social media. So when we studied the sample, we came up with two narratives which were clearly jumping out from those 10 pieces of news. And the first was the threat of fascism growing in Ukraine, and the core of this narrative was the victory of Russian people in the Great Patriotic War, which is the considered as the sacred achievements of Russians in history, and labeling somebody as fascist or executioner or banderovцы is a very emotional appeal to the Russian people, and it immediately raises the response from them. And of course, Crimea became another symbol of the glorious history of Russia, and generally it was defined as in reports, Channel 1 reports, as the third defense of Sevastopol. West versus Russia. West includes the European countries also, and this narrative is mostly based on the dichotomy on largely on binary terms and well-rooted set of stereotypes, where Russia, of course, portrayed as the loyal to the traditional values, moral, spiritual, and Western European countries as immoral and acting in their vested interests. And within this narrative, it is important to notice that it is European countries and America were not portrayed only as antithesis, but also as an active player, as an aggressive enemy, as the threat to Russia. So 6 pieces of news out of our sample was about the first narrative and 4 about the second. And I would like to show you the most bright, vivid examples from this sample. This is a very famous report, which then was cited as the illustration of the Russian propaganda against Ukraine. This was the report presenting the refugee, the lady on top, from the Ukrainian town of Slavyansk, who was reported that she fled with her 4 children from the Ukrainian army atrocity. And according to her, she was presented as an eyewitness that Ukrainian army gathered most of the locals in the main square of Slavyansk, Lenin Square. It's important, that's why I'm telling the name, Lenin Square, and just in front of them they crucified a 3-year-old boy on the information bulletin and left him to bleed out until he died, and forced his mother to watch it, and then they killed the mother also. So that was the scandalous report, which made a very huge response in the audience, of course. And then the Stop Fake identified as the report as the fake, starting from spotting the inconsistencies in the report. For example, they noticed that there is no Lenin Square in the town, and then they followed the oppositional newspaper journalist who visited the town and interviewed a number of residents, saying that none of them neither saw anything similar nor heard about it. And here you can see what terms the lady in the report used to describe the Ukrainian army, and what the ladies interviewed by the oppositional journalist told about the soldiers. This is another report. On the top you can see the image coming from Channel 1. They reported that this is the proof how the Ukrainian army killed the civilians. And then Stop Fake replied that actually this is the picture of 1995, and it shows the war of Russian army against civilians during its war against separatists. And for the sake of their narrative, they just cropped out the Russian soldier standing right at this shallow ditch. And another very famous piece of news, when a famous TV host, Mikhail Leontiev, announced that he has a sensational photo proving that the Malaysian Boeing jet MH17 was shot down by the fighting jet of Ukraine, and that the picture showing how it was firing a missile at the MH17. And according to Leontief, the photo was supposed to refute the widely held view in the West and the European countries that the jet was actually shot down by the Russian-backed separatists in the eastern Ukraine, and openly shifted the blame on Ukraine and European countries and America, who supported, according to the words of Leontief, Ukraine in this crime. In reply, Stop Fake presented the evidences. They put a great deal of effort into convincing its audience that actually the image could not be considered as authentic, and they presented the evidence how this image was constructed with the manipulation software. Then we came to the Twitter's comments, how those pieces of news were perceived and commented in Twitter. So we collected around 6,000 tweets. It's not a big data, but it fitted our research purposes, to perform the content analysis and also our capacities, because in a moment you can see that there were a lot of emotions in those tweets, and it required the human coding. So we discovered that actually the Twitter users showed a comparatively high level of distrust to the pieces of news coming from Channel 1. And it is probably interesting to notice that all comments showing the trust, not a big number, but still, were from Twitter users based in Russia. And all comments come saying that it was not truth, we do not believe it, were coming from all other Twitter users, mostly based in Ukraine, but in other countries as well. But then we also wanted to see the emotions inside those groups of trust and distrust comments. And we discovered that mostly people were disgusted with the news, and then were also making a lot of jokes about them. So they were kind of sarcastic about the pieces of news. So here you can find the examples of the emotions inside the groups of distrust comments and trust comments. I hope you can see and read them. So my last slide is our conclusion. So we actually understood that the fake news were the distillation of the most important strategic narratives of the government. So they were produced, of course, not to report on anything new which was going on in Ukraine, about new facts or anything, but they, of course, were produced to support already existing narratives in Russia, so that the constantly coming information would circulate among Russian people and support those narratives, and that conflict provide the territory for digital suspicion. It is not even close to the power of television, but it is there, and it gives a great hope for the internet as a territory, as a multimedia forum, as a democracy forum, and that Twitter users, at least in this particular case, were trusting the pieces of news coming from the biggest and most popular channel in Russia. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to be here and present to you some of the work that the Public Data Lab hosted here at the IPR has done on fake news this year. This is our website. We are a network of researchers working to facilitate research engagement and public debate around the future of the data society. And as Jonathan mentioned earlier, we've been really busy this year organizing research events in Copenhagen, Amsterdam, London, and there will be another one in Paris later this year. And Anders will talk in a minute a bit more about the outcomes of the events in Copenhagen. So in each of these places, we've established collaborations with journalists and contributed to media investigations. And you can see some of the outcomes of these collaborations here. There is an investigation that we did with BuzzFeed News on how fake news sites have adapted to being blacklisted from major ad networks. And there's another investigation that we did in Amsterdam with NRC, a major media outlet in the Netherlands, on the Dutch alt-right online. We also produced a number of research publications, and I will focus on two of them today. The first is a field guide to fake news. This is a research report that explores the production, circulation, and responses to fake news online. And this is done in the form of recipes, which other journalists and researchers can follow and adapt to their own investigations. And the second one is an article called 5 Provocations About Fake News. This is a forthcoming research article that challenges some of the themes that underlie existing debates and research about fake news. And it also proposes some provocations and analytical lenses to enrich the way we understand it. So in this talk, I'll try to draw on both of this a bit to contribute a few points to our discussion about fake news. And before I do that, for those of you who've heard a lot about fake news but didn't have the pleasure to see one item with your own eyes, here is a screenshot from the famous Pope endorses Trump story that gained prominence around the US elections. And the other one is a story about Rage Against the Machine, the band, reuniting and releasing an anti-Donald Trump album. So a leftist fake news story. So in our paper, 5 Provocations About Fake News, we look at current debates and research on this topic and challenge some of the assumptions behind them in these 5 points that are on the screen. And I don't have time to discuss all of them, but I'll take just the first point, and I think Anders will discuss a few other of them in his presentation. So one of the provocations that we propose in this paper is that fake news is not just a virus and its readers are not just lacking better information or education. And this is very timely given the Yale study, which you may have seen released a couple of days ago, suggesting that flagging fake news on Facebook does not have the intended effect of stopping the spread of fake news or getting people to stop believing these stories. And I hope that some of the concepts that we introduce in this paper, in this talk, might help to understand why that is. But first, let's look at current debates. A recurring theme in debates and studies about fake news is the use of biological metaphors to explain the phenomenon. So, for example, a New York Times editorial describes fake news as a digital virus. And other research uses epidemiological models, so disease distribution models, that relate fake news and misinformation to infectious diseases or viruses to simulate their spread. And in these models, users sharing fake news are understood as infected agents or hosts that participate in the transmission of this contagion. And linked to this metaphor is also the portrayal of the public as suffering from various deficiencies. And these deficiencies range from gullibility to short attention spans, which underperform when faced with information overload, or the inability or unwillingness of the public to take in the true facts. So to avoid being misled and manipulated, media literacy, fact-checking, and technological solutions have been proposed. So everything from classes to teach students to spot fake news, mechanisms to flag fake news on Facebook, and initiatives to debunk these stories. And that's my favorite one. There has even been speculation about a potential gullible tag to label social media users who fall for misleading content, which might incidentally also be of interest to advertisers on these platforms. So this is a part of what we've seen so far emerging around fake news. And underlying much of this discourse and solutions, media researchers, and if there are any media researchers in this room, will recognize a common model of communication. And this is known as the transmission model and has been proposed by, written about by J. Scarry back in 1989. So in this view, news, be it real or fake, is a process of disseminating or transmitting information to achieve particular effects on audiences. So to enlighten or entertain them, or to consolidate or change their beliefs. If there are any science researchers in this room, science researchers will recognize in these discussions what in science and technology studies is known as the knowledge deficit model. This model suggests that when the public does not seem to accept or to understand science, we are dealing with a problem of communication or education. So the solution in this model will always be to provide more of the true facts. But there are a number of ways in which these models are too simplistic and lead to the kinds of problems that the Yale researchers have found. For example, biological models and metaphors are problematic in their conception of agency. By portraying users as passive vehicles for contagion, they misconceive the question of agency of individuals who actively contribute to what we could see as creative processes. Then the transmission model of communication also has its flaws. It leaves out the way in which digital content units are also cultural forms. They are ways of representing and performing social identities, shared beliefs, values, and views of the world. And the information deficit model was shown to be flawed because the willingness of the public to accept a piece of information, be it science or news, true or false, is not just an intellectual or cognitive process. It is a social process where trust, credibility, social identities, and relationships between the parties involved are at stake. So for these reasons, in our empirical work on the topic, we try to step back from current models and responses to fake news and think about how we could meaningfully use our experience in science and technology studies, internet studies, and media studies to provide different ways to understand it. And this is the work included in the Fake News Field Guide. And in the remaining time, I will discuss a couple of examples from this, and I'll see how far I can get. So in the field guide, we move away from analyzing and qualifying content of fake news and aim to put content into context with these three simple questions. So the questions that we raise are, who shares it? So who shares fake news? And this question points us towards understanding fake news and memes as modes of political participation. How does it circulate? And what tracking networks is it embedded in? And this points us towards the techno-commercial underpinnings of fake news. And to see where our research comes from, so in asking these questions, we treat fake news as digital culture or of digital culture, because we think that this will help us understand more of its facets beyond just treating it as false content. And for us, digital culture represents interactions between techno-commercial infrastructures, such as digital platforms, the legal and governing principles of these platforms, as well as social practices and cultures of use that emerge around them. Yeah, so our three questions emerge from this understanding of digital culture. Who shares fake news? So how to approach fake news and memes as modes of political participation? And the first thing to say is that fake news does not just randomly flow on social media. Behind them are people and groups, and of course also algorithms, engagement metrics, social media buttons, and so on. But I'll discuss these in the final point. Yeah, so fake news might represent a mode of political expression for particular marginalized or dominant groups, and the means by which social and political identities are being formed, affirmed, performed, and negotiated. So it is important to look not just at circulation numbers or engagement scores, but also at who shares fake news and what functions it may play for the communities that share it. And what we saw in our work was that while fact-checkers would define fake news as false, misleading, or else unverifiable information packaged as news, fake news serves a variety of different purposes for the pages and groups who share it on Facebook. In the case of fake US election news, this might include acting as monetizable clickbait for viral content pages, doing issue work for grassroots activist groups, doing grassroots campaigning work for political loyalists, so for example, pro-Trump campaigning animated by anti-Hillary stories, as well as providing humor for entertainment groups. And all these different functions and forms of work need to be accounted for when designing responses to fake news, or else responses might miss the heart of the problem. And let's take fact-checking, for example. Earlier this year, we looked at whether fact-checking works in the sense of reaching those who engage with fake news on Facebook. And what we saw was that fact-check corrections are readily acknowledged by the communities where fake news circulates. So in fact, fake news and fact-check versions of them actually circulate within very different communities. And this invites the question of the capacity of fact-checking to meaningfully engage the publics of fake news. In addition to fake news, we've also looked at memes as modes of political participation on Facebook. And indeed, we detected a lot of political memetic activity on Facebook. And this graphic shows some of the topics addressed by memes pages seeded by a pro-Trump memes page. And in a sense, we can see all this activity as grassroots propaganda. And we can see this work as challenging maybe some of the more positive ways in which we may think about grassroots and participatory cultures that emerge online to support more progressive ideals. Moving on to our second question, so how does fake news circulate? And the main point that I want to convey here with this example is that false stories are not born fake news. The fact that they become fake news is a distributed accomplishment, and there are key moments and actors that play a crucial role. And here we go back to the Pope endorses Trump story to see what we can learn about it if we look beyond content at its circulation online. So if we trace the circulation of this story online, what we see is that the story started life on an explicitly satirical or fantasy news website. And it receives little circulation until it's being reproduced by another website without indication that it is satire. And once it is being picked up by this fake news site or laundering agent, as we would call it, it triggers a big reaction. It is referenced a lot, especially by fact-checkers and the mainstream media sphere. So it is not the original satirical news that triggers circulation, but the fact that it is being reframed as real news by what we call the laundering agent. Yeah, so both laundering agents and fact-checkers participate in the circulation of these stories. And I think I'll skip this one. The final question that we explore looks at the technicity of fake news, and more particularly at third-party web trackers. So that is small bits of third-party code embedded in these websites in order to collect various kinds of user data, so for analytics, serving ads, and so on. And we do this in order to explore the commercial underpinnings of fake news sites. And this is also important in relation to claims about the profit-making rationales of fake news sites. And what we see is that fake news sites, represented in red in this graphic, tend to have distinctive tracker ecologies, while at the same time also sharing major services with mainstream media, like the big ones at the top of the graph, DoubleClick, Google AdSense, and so on. That's before they were blacklisted. So we see this, while at the same time we also see that, so whereas they do use trackers and they monetize their content, at the same time we also see that their third-party tracker usage is less mature and less sophisticated than mainstream media, who tends to use a lot more trackers and more customized ones. I'll end here, and I'd like to end by saying that for us, fake news encapsulates central aspects of our digital environments and cultures. And studying it can help us understand aspects of contemporary digital, social, and political practices. And how we respond to it has implications not just for practical and political questions about how we deal with misinformation, but also on the future configurations of our social platforms and digital cultures. And we need to ensure that responses take into account all of these complexities. So this is why we've kind of stepped back and looked at the phenomenon in more detail on all these different platforms and with all these different aspects. And I think Anders might speak a bit more about what some alternative forms of intervention that follow this track of investigation might take. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Liliana. I will, in a sense, pick up where Liliana ended. So now you've heard about this field guide to fake news. It's filled with recipes for presumably addressed at practitioners to do stuff when investigating fake news. And after having done this, this field guide, we did a participatory experiment called a data sprint with some of the people who produce news, i.e. journalists in Copenhagen, and asked them, so if we take seriously that these are recipes for investigating fake news, how would you as media professionals, what would you cook with these recipes? And so I'll just give you one example of how, this is the second recipe Liliana showed you for how to track the circulation of fake news across media spaces, how that was picked up by some of the people we would rely on to pick it up, i.e. the journalists, to actually do something, produce different kinds of stories about fake news. So the question they were formulating in their minds, reading through these recipes, was how can we, one of the roles that journalists often assume faced with fake news is that of fact-checking, right? So you could imagine yourself as a journalist saying, well, my role is going to be correcting false stories or misinformation when I find it out there. That's a kind of a quite reactive role. And if you look at the recipes, you'll say, well, so maybe what I'm going to use these tracking recipes for is to keep myself updated on when there is a fake story, and I want to know so that I can write the debunk. They already have tools for that. You might be familiar with a tool like Hoaxy, which tries to flag what might presumably be fake stories. But actually, reading through the recipes, they were more interested in moving into a role where they were going to map the infrastructure or map the biography of a specific piece of fake news. So how do you use digital methods to tell data-driven stories about the lifespan of a fake news story? Is that something a journalist can do? So here's the recipe that we were starting from. This is an example from the Emmanuel Macron gay story, which spread in the final days of the French election. We're working here from this recipe presumes that you have access to a digital curation service called Radarly that collects sniffs on social media platforms and on the open web, stories about certain keywords. So, for example, they have a curated data set on all the presidential candidates for the French election. So you have in the hundreds of thousands of web stories about Emmanuel Macron, and then the idea is, can you narrow that data set into the ones that deal with, is he gay? And then can you track that across media spaces? That's what you see here. You see the spread of that story across media spaces. Now, our two journalists, you see them here on the left at the Sprint, they looked at that and they were thought it was a nice visualization, but when you're going to write a story, you want to have a detailed case. You want to have depth rather than this kind of overview. So they wanted to move that into sort of close context with what actually happens when a story like that gets spread. Okay, so we know that there are, from the initial work we had done, that there are lots of problems if you as a journalist want to, or as anybody want to track. You've come across a story that you think is fake, and you want to track its lifespan. And one obvious one is that the URL of that story is a bad identifier. I mean, if, for example, debunkers normally do not link to where the story comes from, of course the story gets shared in different places, so the URL changes. Keywords is also complicated when you work with very large data sets. If you want to figure out which of all the stories about Emmanuel Macron addresses the "is he gay" question, you very easily get all the stories where he addressed should gay marriage be illegal in France, for example. So there's some quite banal filtering problems. It requires a curated data set, so it requires you to know in advance that now the French election is coming, so I'm going to collect all these stories. It's hard to go back in time if you haven't been aware of that to begin with. And it requires cross-platform comparison, which is difficult. It's very difficult to assess what goes on Facebook and then compare it to what goes on Twitter. I'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, so the method we adopted here was to get 8 misinformation cases from the French election and try to tease them out of this huge Radarly data set. That required some query designs. Then we, realizing that was quite a lot of work, we restricted ourselves to 4 cases. And then you have to go back and forth with filtering and filtering and filtering until you quite manually arrive at a point where you have a data set, in our case, a data set of, I think, in between, depending on which story, between 5,000 and 10,000 stories, where through samples you're confident that you have a data set that is on topic. Now that poses the first problem for a journalist, because they're used to relying on a service like, for example, Hoaxy, which in a busy everyday work environment gives you an immediate flag on whether or not this is a fake story. If you first have to go through this filtering process, which is necessary, that becomes quite an intense workload in the everyday environment of a journalist. Okay, but presuming that you have that time, here's the kind of stories you can tell. So the first one here, the first example I'll give you is about Emmanuel Macron again, but this time the claim that his campaign was financed by Saudi Arabia. Also a fake story, full story. So the chart I'm going to be showing you gives you an idea about the presence of those stories across different platforms. So you have forums in the bottom, blogs, websites, Facebook, media sites, so that's news media websites, and then Twitter on top. That's the way that Radarly categorizes our set, so that's kind of what we have to work from. And then you see the size of the area graph is the estimated reach of that story within the platform. So estimated reach here is measured differently from different platforms. So on Facebook, for example, if a story is shared on a page that has a lot of followers, it gets higher reach. On Twitter, if a story is shared by someone that has a lot of followers, it gets a lot of reach. On a media site, if it is shared by a website that has a high Google ranking, it gets a lot of reach. So these are very incompatible, in a sense, measures. But within Facebook, for example, you can see here that the story is at it peaks on Facebook in the beginning, for example. That it makes sense within each platform. So it begins. This story begins live on a fake website. So this is it looks like this. It's a copy of a Belgian newspaper called The Soir. That whole website mimics how the real The Soir website looks, and then it puts in fake stories. It's now been closed down, but it was active during the election. And so the story is shared twice by that website in the beginning. And then it receives attention when Marion Le Pen from the Front National and some of her followers on Twitter retweets it or tweets it, and it gets reposted on Facebook by a dedicated anti-François Hollande website. Looks like this. Immediately, that triggers a fact-checking response almost the same day. I think it's the day after. The Huffington Post and Le Monde runs debunks on that story. And on Facebook, it has its own local fact-checking response. It gets flagged as fake. So there's an immediate debunk. Then there is a few days later, a week later, there is a media reaction to that where you cite the fact that the Facebook fact check has worked, and so there are websites starting to write about that. Then there's a period of calm, and then when so in a sense you could say that sort of settles it. There's a fake website. It gets retweeted. There is an immediate debunking response, and it seems to go away. Then at the end of March, the Front National is pressed on its potential links to Russia, and they dig out this story, and they turn it into a question of what would you rather have, someone supported by Russia or someone supported by Saudi Arabia? Right, so it's it's revamped, and I think the point here is that going back to some of the stuff we've talked about earlier today is that even though it has been debunked, now it can play a political role now, right? So it gets revamped for political reasons in a spin effort by the Front National. Of course, that triggers debunks again, and then towards the end of the election, it becomes part of the sort of review of what happened during the French election. Were we influenced by Russian operators? What was the role played by fake news and so forth, right? Okay, so what is one interesting point to note here is that when you look at if you size these influences, if you try to compare them, as I said, that's difficult, and I'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. But actually, the Radarly attempts to evaluate how visible these stories are vis-a-vis each other, even across platforms. If you take that measure at face value, then the original story is not visible at all. The stuff that happens on Facebook seems less important. What is really important is that spike on Twitter when it gets appropriated by the Front National campaign for political reasons. That is when it really attains its public visibility. Okay, so here's another example, which has a very different anatomy. That's why I'm bringing it out. It is about Mélenchon, who was the far left candidate, and the claim is that he wears a Rolex. Looks like this. It's a fake photo. It's been photoshopped, the Rolex. It's actually it's an internal dispute on the left. So it's part of the Green Left. It's a blogger on the Green Left that posts this as a sort of taunt to Macron, who's part of the red left, if you will. And that blogger actually immediately debunks his own story. So he claims it, and then he says, I was just joking, it was false. Okay, and so that happens before Radar even tracks this. And the stuff that gives us visibility is that Mélenchon decides to use it ironically in his speeches. So he starts addressing his followers as the no Rolex wearing French people. And so he uses it as a rhetorical strategy in his political campaigning. That's what gives it visibility, right? That's what brings that fake piece of fake news to life. And it stays like that until some of his opponents then at the end of the election are able to share it as true on Twitter. So he actually sort of gives it live support throughout the election, and then in the end, his opponent shares it as if it was real on Twitter. And there is some noise in the data set, so disregard that. And of course, again, it becomes part of the fake news as a topic in the French election towards the end. Just one, again, the same pattern. If you try and compare across these media platforms, what seems really important here is Twitter and the news media sites. What happens on Facebook, in this case, not very important. Then the last one, which we're back here to the Macron is gay set. That is interesting because it's not actually claimed by anyone as true on the web to begin with. It is talked of as unfounded rumors. So it's mentioned on various platforms, but as we have heard, but probably that's not anything to it. This gets picked up as part of what's probably a Russian misinformation campaign. When it really kicks off towards the end of the election, it's because Russia Today claims that WikiLeaks has found evidence in the Clinton email leak that Macron is gay. So they find this lying around somewhere, and then they connect it to the WikiLeaks of the Clinton emails, and sort of tie it in there. And then you have a massive sort of immune response from debunkers that gives us a lot of visibility towards the end. Okay, so I think three very different anatomies of how a fake news story travels through the French election. Okay, so that's basically all I wanted to show you, but I just want to a critical reflection here. I think one of the very challenging things about using this type of data to talk about visibility is exactly the comparison sort of between, again, here we've made the comparison, say, well, what matters is Twitter is more visible than Facebook, or more visible than the blogs, for example, or the websites, or the news media seems more visible, but that is a very hard assessment to make, and I think a huge challenge for this style of research into fake news is that what is it actually we're measuring when we're measuring visibility? And just as an example here, we're comparing two ways of measuring visibility in the Mélenchon Rolex case. So here you see the stories ranked by the Google ranking, and on the top you see, actually it's a very weird chart because the Google ranking starts here. So these are the highest ranking by Google, and these are the lowest ranking by Google. Whereas upwards it's the ones that gets the most shared on Facebook. The point you want to take away here is that what gets shared a lot on Facebook does not receive very high Google ranking necessarily, right? So we really have a huge issue in how we measure visibility and the platform dependencies in that. That's just an afterthought to this style of research, right? Thank you.
So thank you very much for your attention. We've actually, the speakers, I'd like to thank you very much for sticking to the hour that they had, leaving nearly a full half an hour for questions and for discussion, which is great. So I think I would ask you to briefly state your name so we can kind of get to know each other a little bit before your question. And then maybe if you guys are comfortable, take them in batches of, say, 3s and then have a little chat. Is that?
We'll take note.
Exactly. Is that okay? Okay, so let's take right at the back then. Yep, you, yep.
Oh, you need a pen?
I saw you, yeah.
I need a pen.
Okay.
Thank you. I see one here.
Hi, I'm Maya. Thank you all for your talks. My question is about the role of debunking. So you were just saying that, to a certain extent, these stories were sort of, perpetuated by debunking. But then earlier we heard that it's really important to correct people, and repeated corrections sort of changes opinions. So how do you balance that?
Great question.
Hi, I'm Beth. I actually had the same question, and it was more about do we continue to debunk them? Do we ignore them? And what's the line between those two responses?
Great. So we'll group those as question 1. So can I have a second question? Okay, gentlemen. You guys can.
Probably just speak louder.
Okay. Yeah.
My name's David Post. I'm a historian. This is a question for. I'm just going to be very brief and ask 2 very quick questions. For Irina, thank you all 3 of you for your really interesting papers. It struck me that the doctrine of photos, the misrepresentation of other nations, faking border incidents, and so on, are all very reminiscent of Soviet propaganda and indeed propaganda in general. So my first question is, what's new here? My second question is, I suspect that if you asked someone in Soviet Russia in the 1970s whether they believed official propaganda, they'd probably say yes in public, but no in private. So again, do we know the extent to which either these fake news stories can we know the extent to which they're actually believed or not, and again, whether that official propaganda is believed or not.
Great question. Okay, and now number 3, if we can have one more. I saw some people with their hands up earlier. Okay, gentlemen.
Hi, Monia Metar from the School of Management at the University of Bath. Thank you all very much for your presentations. I was interested in hearing a little bit more about your second question, which is related to how the distribution of fake news and what are the key actors in that process. I didn't quite fully appreciate what those actors are and the dynamics of it. Thank you.
What exactly is, sorry?
You didn't what those actors are that are distributing the news and the dynamics of that process. Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
Should we start from the top?
Yep.
I can go first on the first question if you want.
Yeah.
I would 2 points for that. Like one is, which might be stating the obvious, that of course it's possible to have those 2 claims, that fact-checking is important in terms of people's beliefs, and fact-checking is can have detrimental effects in terms of spreading fake news. Those 2 things can exist at the same time and be equally true. And I think to an extent that's the case. From the case studies we've done, it depends a bit on the case. For example, the Macron gay story, it seems very obvious that that was spread much more than it needed to be because of fact-checking. That's not the case at all in the Mélenchon versus Rolex case, for example. So there's a difference between cases. I think the sensible approach would be to say, don't fact-check until something has gained some critical amount of visibility. Just because it's there doesn't mean it has to be fact-checked. And I think what is needed here is an idea of that the web is not, one big open space. It's spherical, and if something only lumbers in very particular pockets of the web for a while, maybe that's the best place to keep it. And then when it moves, so we need some kind of measures for when does it move into mainstream public space, or I mean, we need an idea about the web as a terrain, where it matters where it is and not just that it's there.
I'll also add a few things to that question. So I don't know if you've seen a big study that was published by Yale just a couple of days ago and reported by Politico, which looked at the effects of fact-checking. So that's fact-checking work. And here especially, it was actually about flagging fake news on using the fake flags for stories on Facebook. And what they found was that this mechanism might have unintended consequences, and that the net effect might not even be positive at all. And to give you just one example of that, so what they suggest is that in certain demographics, say young Trump supporters, if I remember well, seeing some stories flagged as fake signals that there might be something wrong with those stories. But it also means that any other story that is not flagged but might be fake, is just that the fact checkers didn't get a chance to look and flag all of them, are tended to be believed even more. So that the critical process disappears from, the critical process is redistributed, the flagging mechanism. And when the flagging mechanism fails, readers tend to believe stories that are not being flagged or use less of their critical capacities on those stories. The other way to think about the question of does fact-checking work is to maybe break it down a little bit and ask, does it work for whom? And also, how does it work for different communities? Because, again, it might have some unintended consequences. So, for example, in our study, what we found is that, say, fact-checking works in the sense that it assembles communities online, on Facebook, but those communities are very different from the communities that it was maybe intended to address, which was the readers of fake news. So so when we looked at whether there is any overlap between the Facebook groups and pages that share fake news and those that share fact-check corrections of the same stories, we saw that there was almost no overlap. There were maybe 5 or 6 groups that were sharing fake news stories that were also sharing their fact-check corrections. So it works, but it assembles with a different public than the one that maybe they expected. So we really need to almost complicate the question a bit more and thinking that who does it work for and how does it work specifically.
Did you want to?
No, I think everything is.
But on the other question.
Yeah, the other question. Yes, thank you for the question. This really good question, and asking about what's new between the propaganda, what was in the Soviet Union, and what we have now. I would say very little, because they're still very bold. So when they present the fake news, the channels, the federal channels, they do not really care if they can be debunked or not in the internet environment. And if they get debunked, they do not notice that. This case about the crucified boy, that was very scandalous, and of course it was discussed in the internet a lot. And then it was not in the mainstream media, it was silence, so nobody apologized or mentioned anything that was not true, until the moment when during the presidential press conference somebody from the audience was bold enough to ask what was this story, what happened with this story. And not even during that moment, nobody apologized for such a piece of propaganda. And then during another news program, the TV host told that, well, yes, the story was not true, but there were a lot of other kids killed during the Ukrainian crisis by Ukrainian army. So why not to think about that? So they kind of apologized, but in a way, like, so it was the fabricated news, but that kind of doesn't change the sense. So even this new environment of doubts, of digital suspicion does not change the fact that the federal channels still feel enough power and produce the fabricated news or the news which go along the strategic narratives of the government and spread them quite actively. And if you ask about the 70s, when people publicly say that yes, they believe to the governmental news, news coming from the governmental channels, and in private, in the kitchen, they discuss it and do not trust them. Well, probably this is still a case also, but we chose this particular pollster, Levada, because it's a non-governmental organization which has been working for a very long time, many years. So it's actually the data which we would trust, and maybe these data is correct enough to believe that this amount of people really watch TV and really trust their source of information, while there is a small amount of people who start doubting and start thinking that this is agitated propaganda, is just about to make people believe in certain things and not about the truth.
And if I could maybe ask David to come and give his card afterwards. You have a colleague in Amsterdam who's working on this question of genres of Russian misinformation, which I'm sure he'd love to share with you as well. Okay, can we take another...
That was a third question.
Sorry, yes.
I was supposed to address
the third question,
the third question, which was on the, to speak a bit more to the point that we tried to make about the distribution and dynamics of fake news stories. And I think that maybe Anders did an even better job than me at explaining that, because he dedicated his whole presentation to what happens to one of these stories and what are all the different functions that it plays throughout its life and all the communities that it animates. But I guess, so the point that we want to make through that study is to take fake news not as a piece of false content, but add back the dynamics into and see it as a process, which may start from, say, a piece of satire or humor being published, and this is something that we've seen in the case of several stories. So something a piece of content being published on a satire website as humor and circulating only in the specific community of that publication and entertaining them. And then several months later, so the story dying down, then several months later, around in this case, around the US electoral campaigns, it being picked up by grassroots campaigning groups, which give it a new breath of life to the story. And in many cases, that's when the story really explodes on Facebook and gains a lot of traction and becomes viral. And this also happens often when the story is being, through different mechanisms, it is, say, copy-pasted or reproduced from what was originally a satirical website to a website which we would call, or was called around those times, fake news website, in the sense that they don't explicitly indicate that this is satire or humor, thus changing the context of that story. And this is what we call laundering agents. So these websites that look for content around the web, and actually some of these fake news producers were interviewed by journalists, and they speak about the process by means of which they source their stories in quite similar terms to mainstream media. So just like mainstream media journalists, they speak about how they have certain sources that they find trustworthy, and they explain which are the sources that they go to. They have verification processes, so again, they have expert sites that they go to verify their stories. So these are the sites that we've called laundering agents. And after the political campaign is over, some of these stories die down. But then again, they gain a second life by being, say, picked up by viral content pages. So pages that are just looking for clickbaity content to make money of them. So in the case of several of the stories that emerge around the US electoral campaign, we found, say, a story that was published by a satire website set at the beginning of 2016, didn't circulate much, then had a big burst towards November, towards the end of the year, then again died down. And then again in, say, February 2017, again it has a little bit of burst because it's being picked up by this viral content page, which looks to make money from this content.
It's quite, just a very short notice. It's interesting, we did the map that Liliana showed in her presentation, actually compares what the story declares itself at. Does it share as real or as fake or as satire? And then it looks at the story it refers to, back to. And very often you have, a satirical story being referred to as real, or a debunk story being referred to as real, and so it's the fact that it's there doesn't really matter to how it gets shared.
Yeah, and I guess that's also why we emphasize that we shouldn't just look at the engagement score, but really look at all the different phases in the life of the story, because it really might play very different functions for the different communities that share it, which, might not resume to fake news.
Great, could I take 3 more questions? So 1, 2, 3. Yeah,
exactly. I've had 2 thoughts while I've been listening to this. One is the influence of fake news when it's already been debunked externally by external engines, if you like, technological engines. Do you think that could be, would that be the same if there was a greater penetration amongst the general public of those sort of logic and critical thinking skills to stop those news, that fake news from disseminating in the first place? And then, as a corollary of that thought that I had, is anybody looking at where the spaces are in your distribution diagram? So you're looking at fake news being picked up, and redistributed, but is anybody looking at where it's not being redistributed, those sort of spaces are repeatable across? Do you understand the sort of the converse of looking at the reposting and stuff? Are there nodes in the network, if you like, who are acting as a brake on that? Is that being studied?
Great, and then the second, yeah.
Hi guys, I'm Jean-Michel Carter. I'm a scientist here, and I'm also a member of the Transhumanist Political Party. You've probably not heard of that before, but basically, so the question, is there a specific platform that you think might be more susceptible to spreading fake news, and why? What are the factors?
So some of the fake news seems quite professional. So how professional are the people who are actually making it, and are they funded by clicks, political campaigns, or is it the Russian government?
Good question.
So I get to choose which question to start with. So I'll choose Jean-Michel's question. So is there a specific platform that may be more susceptible to sharing fake news? So what we've seen is that, so if you look at the circulation of a story that has been labeled as fake news across digital platforms, what we've seen is that Facebook is by far the space where these stories get most engagement. And then again, we've seen, and we also see the other side of it with Anders's presentation, where the fake stories circulate a lot on Facebook, whereas the fact-check corrections might gain more prominence, say, in Google rankings, so in other spaces than Facebook. And part of why fake stories circulate so much on Facebook really has to do with the logics of this platform, the logics that are being inscribed into the interfaces and mechanisms through which we engage with this platform. And a big part of this is the logic of instant sharing and the logic of metrification and the fact that Facebook rewards content that spreads really quickly, and it rewards it by giving it even more visibility in other people's news feeds. So really, I think for us, one important question that emerged from this study is that we start with fake news, but actually what are the really interesting processes to look at? So fake news is just a starting point for trying to understand how our digital environments function and what consequences they have on our political processes and so on. So it's really important to inquire a bit more into how social media logics have affected and have made possible not just the spread of fake news, but how they have also become infiltrated in mainstream media and journalism, and how they've started to affect the way in which journalists produce truth. And that's very much tied to the phenomenon of fake news.
Good questions. A lot of good questions that I don't have so many good answers for. I think the first question about the critical thinking is more a question for the keynote we heard today. I don't feel that we can answer. We have to have the kind of data that was in that project, I think, to say something about that. It would be really interesting to look at where fake misinformation, whatever you want to call it, does not go. If there are these spheres of the web that are immune to it, or we haven't done it, that would be a great project. We'll do it. In terms of the question about which platforms, I think that actually there's a qualification to that question, which is the platforms are not the same in different countries or different social contexts. And for example, when we look at the French election, it's actually Twitter that is the most important platform. I think that has to do with how Twitter is used in France.
Right.
That's my guess. At least I would know that in Denmark, for instance, Twitter has a very low penetration and is only used by politicians and journalists, but not by the general public, which is very different from the US. So, in order to know, I think it's not just platform logics, but also the cultural appropriation of those platforms, which is different from country to country.
Exactly, yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in Russia the same. There is the specification of platform. There are some Russian-speaking social media known as Одноклассники, which is classmates.ru, or Vkontakte, which are very famous inside the Russian community. And of course the mainstream media, the news coming from the mainstream media are spread mostly there because people can discuss the news over there. We picked up Twitter for the research purposes also because it was easier to track the links to the debunked information. But we are thinking about how to research, how to study the discussions over the fake news in those specific social media for Russia, because the people are very active, and probably the audience for these platforms are more consistent with the audience for the television, because in our case we've got two different audiences, the audience for the television and the audience for Twitter, which are, and they are not a bit, but quite different. Well, that where we look at in our further studies probably, but yeah, about the platforms.
And I can add a bit more to the first and last question. So in terms of, yes, are there places where these stories don't circulate, which is a good question. And I think originally some of the first reports that emerged around the US elections was about these like reports that say Democrats were relieved to know that Trump supporters were more likely to fall for fake news stories than Democrat supporters. But these reports have been moderated, and we've seen both pro-Trump and anti-Trump stories, so leftist fake news stories circulating around the U.S. elections. So it's not a matter of political leaning in terms of the circulation of fake news stories. Maybe where we have seen a difference is in terms of, so whereas both, say, right-leaning and left-leaning Facebook groups would share fake news stories, what we've seen in our work is that it was more likely for, say, journalists or left-leaning progressive Facebook pages to share the fact-check corrections. So where you see the difference is in terms of engagement with the fact-check corrections of these stories. And for the last question, which was how professional are the people who are sharing it, I think that really that varies a lot. But for me, that's a very fascinating area of study. So really taking seriously the category of fake news producer and studying it as seriously as you study the making of journalism. So really going and interviewing and talking to these people to ask them, so how do you source your stories? How do you verify them? Like, how do you decide what's a good story and what's not a good story? And there are a few journalists who have done that. So they've tracked down a few fake news producers and they've interviewed them, and they're really interesting interviews. And so the two interviews that were produced basically show that they are, or several others, but they are usually, they are people in their own homes who are doing this as a side business, as a source of money, but really their processes vary from being very simple, so them doing it themselves and just having a set of websites that they look at to source their content and then copy-pasting their content, to hiring a whole team of writers. So the ones that make more money and have more profit, and this profit can range in some of these interviews, say everything from like 10,000 to 30,000.
I'm going to have to stop you just because I'm afraid I think we could continue going for a very long time. Aware that it is now a very thin wedge before lunch, and the nice thing is that I saw there were a lot of questions. I believe that we have lunch from 12:30 for an hour and a half, and 90 minutes we'll be around, and so I suggest that if anyone has any other questions, I would extremely warmly welcome you to come and talk to us, and maybe show these guys one more round of applause for coming and joining us.